I'm interested in how this relates to gentrification of the mind. Do you think the gentrification of New York City has like affected the ability of ACT UP to like activate, or like other activist groups like ACT UP, and like how does that function, I guess?
I think it did at its height, because there's something in gentrification that's very homogenizing and conforming. And in order to be successful to the extent that these people were, you have to be outside of the system. You know, you heard a lot of people say no more business as usual. Well, if you're taking on the drug companies and the government and the New York Times and the art world, you're not going to get a job at the New York Times. So there's a way that if you're trying to play both sides of it, you're less effective sometimes in the oppositional role. Now, that's not always true. But we're in the classic period of gentrification that I discussed in my book, Gentrification of the Mind, is very different than the time that we're in now. You know, and I think it's very unclear where we are right now, because it's really chaotic. The rules are unclear. In terms of gentrification, there's so much empty space in cities now, because not only has all the housing stock been seized, but as you all know, there's empty storefronts everywhere. There's empty office space. There are empty hotel rooms everywhere. And we haven't figured out how to respond to that. It's a different kind of environment. But definitely, homogenization does make it harder to be oppositional. That is true. Yeah.
Watching the film, and always whenever I engage with ACT UP history, I'm struck by just how joyful and fun it seems, and how attractive this group of people is. And there's like they talked about it in the film, there's a youthful energy. And I've been involved in activism from my time at Florida before, and I sense in a lot of activists today a lack of that sense of joy or freedom, or that culture is not really being cultivated in activist spaces today, at least from my experiences. I'm curious what practices from ACT UP or values could be engaged today for activists who want to.
Well, you know, it's a very old discussion, because when Emma Goldman was organizing anarchists in the 1920s, she said, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. You know, so movements have to make the lives better of the people who are in the movements also. If your movement is based on like guilt, you're not going to go anywhere. But I think that there's conflicting ideas about what activism is. And for these people, activism is opening doors and creating new opportunities and new ideas with an enthusiasm. There are some people today who think that activism is criticizing people, taking them down, and stopping them. And it's a completely different impulse. You know, because one of the great things about ACT UP is that it was not a consensus-based movement. So people did not have to agree on everything. There was a bottom line. There was a one-sentence statement of unity: direct action to end the AIDS crisis. That's it. And it was direct action as opposed to social service provision. But if you had an idea that was direct action to end the AIDS crisis, basically you could do it. And like, if you and I, let's say you wanted to do something and I didn't like it. Now this is a pre-gentrification New York, so people yell a lot. It was very Jewish and Italian and Puerto Rican, and you know. And so if you had an idea and I didn't like it, we would fight about it. We would argue, but in the end, I would not try to stop you from doing it. I just wouldn't do it if I didn't agree with it. I would get my people to do our idea. So when you look at the history of ACT UP, you see simultaneity of action. There's a lot of different actions going on at the same time, and had a radical democracy structure that enabled people to really be effective from where they're at. And this is like a big lesson for politics, because people can only be where they're at. You cannot force people to be in a place that doesn't really make sense to them. You really can't. So if you have Big Tent politics and a bottom line that facilitates all different kinds of people being effective on all different kinds of levels and all different kinds of ways at the same time, you're more likely to achieve a paradigm shift. My sense of history, and if you disagree with me, please say so, is that movements that have tried to force people to all agree on one common strategy or one common analysis have always failed. And I don't think there's any exceptions to that. Because it's anti-human, it's not what people are like. You know, especially if you're fighting for a world that embraces difference, your movement also has to do that. So if movements are more creative and open and people aren't trying to force each other to be something that they're not, and they're not trying to control each other all the time, it's more fun. You know, and you can do more interesting things. Well, yes, go ahead.
I have a question, and I almost feel hesitant to ask it. Like, normally I don't feel scared to ask questions, but I guess this question, like, for me brings up almost like a little bit of shame, but I feel like, and I've heard it mentioned in other talks and stuff, like, I feel like, especially with the pandemic, we're sort of in a wake of moral exhaustion. And I know that, like, before the pandemic, whenever I engaged in activism, I mean, there were a few moments when I didn't have it where we sort of had this, like, energy, and there's sort of, like, this, like, ferocity that's sort of, like, a positive ferocity that we can see in Act Up. But, and especially when things are really specified, like, I'm thinking about Defund the Police, like, that's a very specified movement that captures so many things. But then at times when I step away from specific movements and it feels like everything is wrong at the same time, I think that me and other individuals might feel morally exhausted at times and sort of, like, have lost some of the funness and the sexiness that can come with activism, and that it's a necessary piece of activism. So, like, what I guess my question is what do you think activism looks like in the face of moral exhaustion?
Okay, well, let me go back a little bit.
Okay.
So there's always a big range of things that are available to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, direct action is only one of them. Mm-hmm. Like during the AIDS crisis, there were people whose main thing was that they walked the dogs of people with AIDS so people could keep their pets. Mm-hmm. That's incredibly important. If you're really sick, you want your pet, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's what they wanted to do, and that's what they did do. There was a group called God's Love We Deliver. Mm-hmm. And they made home-cooked meals and brought them to homebound people with AIDS. Mm-hmm. And don't forget that this is a period of really severe familial homophobia. So certain kinds of family networks that were not available to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and then there were the Act Up types. Mm-hmm. But, you know, you have to assess what's right for you. Mm-hmm. And make decisions, you know, what your impulse is. And if you don't feel like doing anything, then don't push it because you probably won't be good at it at that time. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? In terms of the movements that are going on today, you know, one of the things I learned, because I just published a book, I should have brought it actually, but it's a history of Act Up New York, and it's 700 pages. It weighs 2.5 pounds, which is why I didn't bring it. Now where was I going with that? Okay. Oh yeah. One of the things I learned is that it's very, very hard to find out what activist movements are doing, historically and in the present. Like right now, we know that there are movements in every city in this country dealing with police violence. They're in Milwaukee, right? They're in Birmingham, they're everywhere, but we don't know the names of the people who are the local organizers. We don't know what their relationship is to city municipalities. Are they working with them? Are they opposing them? We don't know what their strategies are. You know, and it's very hard to learn that information. So until you have somebody who's been around a movement for 40 years or can interview hundreds of people, it's hard to pull it together because corporate press will never tell you accurately what's going on. So there's always more going on than you think is going on, you know. And what I find is that look in your own, if you really want to get involved in something, look in your own life, see what is something that is immediate to you that you can see a solution for. And that's a really key element to choosing because we have to be the experts on our own issues. We have to design the solutions. If you're begging the powers that be to fix it, they will never ever fix it. They don't want to fix it, and they don't know how. So if you pick something that affects you and that you're close to, and you take the time to understand it, and you design a solution that is reasonable and winnable and completely doable, then you can build a campaign around it. You know, and I think that if you really want to act, I think that's the place to start, instead of like looking what's out there that you can just jump on if you're not really compelled towards it. You know what I mean? I hope that helps.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So wondering about your book, like what was the process like of putting together such a big book, and how long did it take?
Thank you for asking. So in 1979, when I was 21, I dropped out of college. I'm not advising anyone to do that, but I did do that. And I became a journalist in the burgeoning underground newspaper world of feminist newspapers and gay and lesbian newspapers. At that time, feminist and queer things were never covered in the mainstream press, and every city had at least one feminist newspaper and at least one queer newspaper, and some had more. And there was this whole cadre of journalists who worked for free, who were out there like trying to find out what were our issues, what was our point of view, and defining it. The year I started, 79, is a really important year historically for where we are now, because it's the year before Reagan is elected. It's also the year of the Hyde Amendment. So abortion became legal in 73. In 79, the Hyde Amendment took away Medicaid funding for abortion. So we really only ever had abortion rights from 73 to 79, where people didn't have to pay, right? So that's when I started. 1981 is when AIDS was first recognized by science. It's not the beginning of AIDS. AIDS is probably 100 years old, but it's when science first noticed it. So I was already a reporter in the gay press. And from the beginning, AIDS was completely misrepresented. I'll just tell you like the beginning of how misrepresented it was. So in 1981, homosexual sex was illegal. The Supreme Court did not overturn those sodomy laws until 2003. I don't know if you realize that. In New York City, there was no anti-discrimination laws. A gay person could be kicked out of an apartment or fired from a job. We could be denied public accommodation, like thrown out of restaurants or denied service in hotels. Familial homophobia was the cultural norm, and street violence from both the police and straight people was very common. It was called gay bashing. It was like a kind of public entertainment. So it was an extremely oppressed minority that were one of the key communities affected by this virus. And because society was so homophobic, like now we know that sexuality is different in each person and it can change over the course of your life. But in 1981, people didn't understand that. And they thought that homosexuality was one thing that had a cause, and the cause was biological. And there was a lot of pseudoscience around 1980 about like homosexuality is caused by your hypothalamus gland. This was serious discourse. So in 1981, the first public announcement of AIDS is the New York Times, July 3rd, 1981. The headline was 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco. Now what that headline meant to people was the biological disease of homosexuality itself. And so the first name for the disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. Now what's so crazy is that there's no such thing as gay-related immune deficiency because there's no biomarker for queerness. It has no biological element. So it's a fantasy. And then they had phrases like gay cancer. There's no such thing as gay cancer. Okay, cancer cannot be gay. But this is how it started. And as a reporter in the gay press, while the mainstream press was either misrepresenting or ignoring, because don't forget, at this time, the New York Times would not use the word gay. They wouldn't say that people died of AIDS. They said they died of coronary arrest. And they would not say the name of your surviving partner. So those of us in the gay press, we were the only ones who could, it was our job to like figure it all out. So in those years, I wrote all kinds of journalistic stories on like pediatric AIDS, which was huge in New York. A lot of children were born HIV positive at that time. Now, no children are no longer born HIV positive in the US. But that was a huge issue. Women were excluded from experimental drug trials. Women could not get into experimental drug trials because the pharmaceutical companies were afraid of, birth defects, that they would be sued. So I covered that. When the city closed the gay male bathhouses, I covered that, which shows you how chaotic everything was, because women were not even allowed in the bathhouses. I had never been in a bathhouse. But, reporters were dying and editors were dying and nobody knew what the stories were, and it was very chaotic. So by the time I got to Act Up, so Act Up is founded in March 10th, 1987. And I came in July 87. I had already been covering AIDS for like 5 or 6 years. Then I was in Act Up. Then Act Up had a split in 92, 93 and kind of dissipated, even though it still technically exists. 96 is the good drugs are made available, where if you become HIV positive, you can live a full lifespan. And 1999 is the internet revolution. So this whole movement is before the internet. There's no email, there's no YouTube, there's nothing. There's no cell phones. So in 99, if you Googled Act Up, you would find nothing because none of our material was digitized. So in 2001, it was called the 20th anniversary of AIDS, but it was actually the 20th anniversary of noticing AIDS. I was driving around LA, because I'm a novelist primarily, and I was like in this little white rental car, and I was trying to like break into Hollywood, which I did not succeed. But it was the 20th anniversary of AIDS, and I was listening to the radio, and the guy said, at first, America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. And I almost crashed the car. I thought, oh no, this is going to be one of these bullshit stories about how the dominant culture was so benevolent, and they realized, well, none of that is true. What the truth is, as you saw, thousands of people fought until the day they died, right, to force this country to change. So Jim Hubbard and I felt very responsible to our dead friends. And we started the Act Up Oral History Project in 2001, which you can go to. It's actuporalhistory.org. And for the next 18 years, we interviewed 188 surviving members of Act Up and put all the interviews up on the website, which has had 14 million hits. And we collected 2,000 hours of archival footage. Now, that's actually not a lot. This is before cell phones. So for a movement, my book covers 87 to 93, 6 years, 2,000 hours is like 82 days. That's all the footage that we have. But then Jim Hubbard made this film. And then after that, some revisionist histories started to appear. That sort of John Wayne the story. So let me explain what I mean by that. So in America, we're always contending with John Wayne. We're always contending with this idea of the white male heroic individual who's going to come in and rescue everybody and save everybody. And they never do that, and it doesn't exist. And, usually they cause more harm than anything. But this is like the American myth. This is the American myth of the individual hero. And this revisionism started saying that a handful of white male individuals, maybe 5 or 6, were the ones who transformed the AIDS crisis. Because that fits the American ideal. It Americanizes. But not only is it inaccurate, it's also impossible. Because in America, that's not how change gets made. Change gets made by coalitions. So it would be completely counterproductive to people today who want to create change to get a message that 5 heroic individuals can make a paradigm shift. It's not true. So Jim and I became extremely upset, and we tried to figure out what to do. And we spent a couple of years trying to find someone else to write this book, and nobody would do it. And then we realized I had to do it. But I didn't want to because I'm really a novelist. But I did it. So I spent 3 years rereading all the interviews that Jim and I had conducted. And the first thing I realized right away was that this history book could not be written chronologically because it wouldn't be accurate, because so many things happened at the same time that the truth had to do with simultaneity. Now, fortunately, because I'm a novelist, I'd had a lot of experience with formal invention, so I knew how to create a book that would tell the story using structures of simultaneity. And I did it, and then I published it. It was 700 pages. So that is the long story. So it's a lifetime thing, you know. But with AIDS, most of the people who started out with me as AIDS reporters, most of them died. There are some who are still alive, but, you know, because so many people died, especially in the early years, that I think that those of us who survive had this big sense of responsibility. I'm over it now. I don't have to do anymore. But, you know, because if you don't do it, nobody else is going to do it because people aren't there, you know, so there's that whole issue. So that's a long answer. Yeah.
I really appreciate the documentary, and your book sounds really fascinating. I look forward to reading it. And I noticed within the documentary, you talked about how the book couldn't be chronological, but the documentary itself does very much follow this chronological format. And I noticed a couple of different techniques they use, such as not having an overarching narrator and having these timelines, so it's like you get these moments in time. I think one of the things that was really effective about this documentary was in having the voices of so many different people show you that it really wasn't just a small group of white gay men, it was a broad coalition of a lot of different people. But I was wondering about the choice to not have an overarching narrator and to have this sort of chronological format to organize the documentary. And then also, if I noticed correctly, I think you're in one clip, and it's a clip where you're sort of critiquing the protest in the Catholic Church for, you're saying the lying down, the dying was very effective, but the yelling was alienating people. I wonder why you chose that, if you had other clips, and so those are the
Okay,
questions.
great, thank you. So the first thing is when you make a film, it's really different than writing a book. You can't put in as much information. And making a documentary film really depends on what your footage is. You know, so if you don't have footage of something, it's really hard to cover it because you just end up with talking heads. So some very key ACT UP things are not in the film, like the needle exchange. ACT UP won needle exchange for New York City, and it's a very dramatic story. And there's nothing about it in the film because we didn't have any footage. And there's a lot of things we didn't have any footage of. So that's why Jim decided to do it that way. Yes, so the reason so what you see me saying, I'm wrong. You know, and we wanted to show us being wrong. And this is part of my whole body of work. If you've ever read Conflict is Not Abuse or any of my other books, I really think that this idea that people have to be perfect and right all the time is terribly defeating. And this idea that, you know, if you're trying to do the right thing and you make mistakes or you are human, that you're terrible and you should be, you know, trashed is crazy. So we decided to show me being wrong. So the reason I said that, so as you know, so this is just to historicize, this is at a time before the priest sex scandal. So the Catholic Church was extremely powerful, and the cardinal was more powerful than the mayor of New York and was in office longer. And what was happening there was that we were trying to get condom distribution in the public schools. And usually the Catholic Church would stay in their lane with the Catholic schools. But in this case, they were getting their people on the public school boards to stop this condom distribution. So we had to look at ourselves and say, like, why are we afraid of the Catholic Church? Why are we afraid of confronting the Catholic Church? Is it because we really believe their view of us? You know, we had to overcome that. So we decided to do this action. Now, at that time, so this is pre-gentrification New York, most people in ACT UP were Catholic or Jewish. There were some Protestants. And the Protestants were really worried about the action looking like it was anti-Catholic. The Catholics and the Jews really didn't care if it looked anti-Catholic. But so the compromise was reached that we were going to do a silent die-in. You saw the planning meeting during the homily. So I went into the church agreeing to do that. And we were about to do that, and then Michael Petrelis jumps up and in his New Jersey accent starts screaming at the cardinal, "You're killing us, you're killing us, stop it." You know, and you saw all the chaos, right? So when I stepped out of there, I thought this was terrible because we had agreed and he went against it. And that's what you saw, that moment. It was like the first moment. But then it turned out to be this amazing action that was like in newspapers all over the world. And it was a turning point for queer people and people with AIDS, I think, historically. Because it was homosexuals with AIDS disrupting Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. I mean, there had never been anything like that before. And it really changed the movement. And just interesting postscript. In the meeting after the action, because we always had post-action meetings to evaluate, people were mad at Michael. They were like, you know, why did you do that, blah, blah, blah. But no one ever suggested throwing him out of the organization. We didn't have a concept of throwing people out. No one was ever thrown out of ACT UP because you have to have supremacy ideology about yourself, right, to throw somebody out of a movement like that. And we were living in a state of illegality. People were dying. Nobody cared whether we lived or died. We didn't see ourselves as higher. And so I think that that's really interesting. Years later, when I interviewed him, I was like, "So Michael, why did you do that?" And he said, like, "I was really angry because no one would let me in their affinity group." And what's interesting about that is that it's just human. You know, like people get upset and they act out and they do things. And sometimes in this case, it turned out to be for the best. And sometimes it's not. But it's like, that's the way it is. And that's life. And, you know, none of us is any better than anybody else. And I think ACT UP really understood that. And it was very pressured. I mean, we were very young. And our friends were, you know, an AIDS death is a terrible, terrible death. You know, people go blind and get demented and they waste and they're like 24 years old and you're 24 years old. It was horrible. It was very pressured and there was a lot of acting out and that's just the way it was. Yeah.
I've gotten into discussions with friends.
Can you be louder, please?
I've gotten into discussions with friends recently about like people not feeling like activist groups have the ability to like change things on like a federal or like larger level than local. And I was just wondering if you think that the effectiveness of activism groups has changed since like ACT UP in like the 80s and 90s and like what's going on today.
No.
Yeah.
I just think you have to build campaigns. Let me lay out what I mean by that. You pick an issue, you design the solution, you present it to the powers that be, they say no. Then you do what Martin Luther King called self-purification, or ACT UP called nonviolent civil disobedience training, and you do nonviolent direct action in a dramatic way that communicates through the media to the public that you have the solution to this problem. And your actions should have demands that are reasonable, that can actually be done. And you build a campaign where each of your actions is designed towards your demand. The mistake that people are making, I think, is that they're doing one-offs. One-off actions that take a lot of effort to organize and that don't lead to anything. And then the energy gets dissipated. But when you build a campaign, it's a whole different matter. Now, the win that you're after is bigger than that issue itself, right? So, because movements need victories, it's very important that you have demands that are winnable. And then you coalesce people, and they start to learn how to build a campaign. And people get encouraged because there's been a victory. And then now you feel more empowered, and you know more about how the structures work. And then you try to go to something bigger. And what happens is that you build a counterculture around these kinds of campaigns. And it becomes, if you're lucky at some point, the zeitgeist. You can't force it. That's the thing. You know, when you're in a period where that's not happening, it can feel difficult because it's kind of like a politics of repetition. Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing you talk more about because there's such a willingness to be in the group. You talked about not having to be forced into the group or being forced out also, and seeing the sad end where there's conflict within the group about what to do next, and then there creates a divide about the victories or the victories not being enough. And I'm interested in hearing you talk more about that and the relationship to the willingness to be in the group where there is no commitments, I mean, for good reason, but it also creates this now maybe like inner conflict that feels, I'm not sure how to describe it.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I don't think that movements can last forever. A really, really good run is sometimes 4 to 6 years. I'm going to answer your question, but I just want you to understand what ACT UP accomplished in 6 years. They forced the FDA to change the way they approved drugs so people who were sick could get the drugs that they needed. They did a 4-year campaign that changed the definition of AIDS so women could get benefits and be admitted into experimental drug trials. This is such a far-reaching victory. Today, any woman in the world who's HIV positive who takes a medication is taking something that was tested on women because of that campaign. They made needle exchange legal in New York City, which transformed the epidemic. They defeated the Catholic Church and got condoms distributed in public schools. They started Housing Works, the organization for homeless people with AIDS. I mean, these are substantial, material, concrete victories that maybe have saved lives in this room. I mean, maybe people in this room who would have been born HIV positive, if there had never been an AIDS activist movement, were not. You know what I mean? The impact on the world is just enormous of what these people accomplished in a short period of time. And then there's things that they failed to accomplish. I think the reason ACT UP broke up, I think there's 2 big reasons. One is I think it was really rough in there. I mean, people were very sick and dying all the time, and it was very hard. And, at the beginning, we made a lot of gains, but like around 91, 92, there was no progress being made with the treatments, and a lot of the leadership were dying. And the thing with an AIDS death is the person falls apart in front of you. It's not like, they go home and you don't see it. You see the disintegration. And I think it really trashed everybody. So I think that was a big factor. Then there's also the factor that at the beginning, when there were no treatments whatsoever, everybody was in the same boat. So you could be a movie star like Rock Hudson and you're still going to die, even though Ronald Reagan is your friend. But once we started to win treatments, the fact that there's no coherent healthcare system in this country meant that access to those treatments was not equal. And so certain constituencies in AIDS activism, people with private insurance, were getting access to treatments that other people couldn't get. And this inequality, this question of access, created divisions. Because ultimately, ACT UP and all of AIDS activism was able to beat HIV, but they couldn't beat capitalism. So pharma's greed was the thing, and that was not what we thought was going to be the ultimate obstacle. We thought once the treatments were there, it was going to be done. So that's what I think broke it up. But it doesn't take away from what it did accomplish. Yeah.
So I'm in environmental.
Can you be louder, please? I'm old.
I get it. I'm in environmental and urban studies major, and one of my main interests is climate change denial. I'm wondering how to convince people that something they don't believe is real, is actually real. Does that make sense?
That's really hard. And all I can tell you, I don't have an answer to that, but I can tell you my own experience. Because I've been in movements, other movements, where the other side is never going to change their mind for 1 second. I'm very involved in Palestine solidarity, right? And people who are very strong Zionists are not going to change their minds. Or if you're in reproductive rights, people who are anti-abortion, they're not going to change their minds. So your goal is not to change their minds. Your goal is to engage in a public debate that is done in a way that's savvy, so that you're doing a piece of theater for the other people who are watching, so that they hear the logic of your argument. Because the thing is, you don't have to convince everybody in order to move forward. You have to convince what's called a critical mass. And you're never going to convince everybody. So if you find that somebody is really unmovable, forget about it. Why are you wasting your energy on them? Try finding people who you might want to work with you, or who maybe you can learn from and they can learn from you. Yeah.
So I have like a secondary question
Mhm.
to that, which is, ACT UP broke up because they encountered Big Pharma, and like arguably the civil rights movement encountered the most resistance when it tried to like create more social services. When like groups run up against these really like abstract structures like the medical system, how do you like make that into a meaningful debate that you can like show people? Because it's
Well, debate you can do. Whether you could beat global pharma is another question. I mean, it was really interesting. Interesting is the wrong word. It was like very annoying to see the repetition with COVID, that we have a vaccine and then we still have countries who can't afford it. And this was just like AIDS meds. We had AIDS meds, but global pharma is so greedy that entire countries couldn't get it. And what it made me realize is that we don't just need national health, we need an international healthcare system. We need a global healthcare system where every person in the world has access to standard of care, because pandemics don't care about borders. It's an absurd, concept. And once you have existing treatments, they should be available, right? We all know that. But just because you can't, let me say it this way. I think in American history, there's two different strains of movements. There's revolutionary utopian movements, and there's reform movements, and they're both very important. And so like the utopian movements, I would say like utopian socialists of the 1840s, the anarchists of the 20s, the communists of the 30s, the hippie movement, gay liberation, black power, these are utopian movements. Then you have reform movements that are like ending slavery, women having the vote, making abortion legal, AIDS activism. And the society moves forward when both of these movements are healthy and are dialogic with each other. When you have gay rights and gay liberation, black power and civil rights, that's when you have the most progressive periods. So you can move forward, but how to defeat global capital, I do not have the answer for that. But it doesn't mean that you can't do anything, right? Yes.
Hi. I was actually, when you said piece of theater, that's actually very related to my question. Is I've seen this documentary before, and I just was really struck again that like really what I would say are like theatrical techniques in a lot of the direct action. The Coffin especially feels theatrical, the throwing of the ashes, the die-in at St. Patrick's Cathedral too. And I guess my question then is like, what kinds of like rehearsal? When do you know what I mean? Like I'm actually wondering like how much kind of, well, and I use that term loosely because I also don't think that it's really necessarily like a compatible thing, saying like this is a metaphor of like rehearsal for theater and something for direct preparation for direct action, but like I guess what kind of preparation, like I feel like we got that sense from the documentary of like where the marketing aesthetics came from, but not really where like the creative sort of genesis.
Yeah, I mean, my theory is that, the most emblematic direct action American history is in very early 1960s when Black students sat in at segregated lunch counters. And what they did was they didn't just have a picket in front saying, end segregation. They did have a picket. But they literally sat at the whites-only counter. So they created an image of the world that they wanted to create. And that's what makes that world possible. And that the people who were in ACT UP were children during that time. Most of us were born in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. At that time, there was no such concept of like gay children or gay youth, but that did not exist, and we didn't know that there were gay communities. We were all out there alone. But we saw images of Black resistance on television, and we saw Black people doing nonviolent civil disobedience and standing up to the police and sitting in and doing direct action. And when I started writing my book, I went back and reread Martin Luther King's 1964 essay, Letter from Birmingham Jail. And that's the one where he lays out his idea of direct action. And it was exactly what ACT UP did, but we never realized it. We never ever read that article together. There was no study groups in ACT UP or anything like that, except for science. But clearly we had internalized. So the idea is that you want to create the image of the world you want to create, and you have to do it in a way that has never been done before. One of the things that defeats the left over and over again is that we do something, it doesn't work, and then we do it exactly the same way again and again. If it didn't work, don't do it again. I know that sounds, stupid, but it's like, that's like really crucial. So ACT UP had an affinity group structure. So we had meetings every Monday night that were public. And we knew that those meetings were infiltrated by the police. And in fact, when I did my book, I have Freedom of Information Act, which is, those police files are at the end of the book. But you can see that ACT UP was significantly infiltrated by the FBI and NYPD. So that was not paranoia, that was actual. So to counter that, we had an affinity group structure, which was private, where people had little groups of 10 or 15 people that would meet in someone's home. And they would plan actions, often illegal ones, that would not come to the floor of ACT UP and did not get approval. But the trust was so strong that ACT UP gave affinity groups full legal support regardless, even though we didn't approve the actions. And a lot of the theatrics that you're seeing, each affinity group would come up with their own thing. And nobody knew what anyone else was doing. So they developed like a creative kind of think tank together, and they would evolve. Yes?
So you've spoken about this like integral relationship between fighting for healthcare and fighting.
Can you be louder?
Yeah. So you talked about this integral relationship between fighting for healthcare and fighting for queer rights. So how do you think that relationship changed in the years after ACT UP in terms of queer activism, and maybe losing sight a bit of this idea of healthcare as being integral to our communities?
Well, I think there's good news and bad news. So let's start with the good news. So the reason that there was an autonomous gay and lesbian movement is not because gay people wanted to have an autonomous gay and lesbian movement. It's because the rest of the left did not want gay people. So like the Communist Party expelled homosexuals, the civil rights movement famously sidelined Bayard Rustin, the feminist movement had lesbian purges. So there was a gay and lesbian movement because nobody else wanted us. Now, when you look at the movements in this country, the movement for Black Lives, the movement for refugee reform or refugee rights, Palestine solidarity, openly queer and trans people are in leadership of all of those movements. So the radical queer movement has moved into all the other radical movements, and that's as it should be. So that, I think, is great. As for the leftover kind of white gay rights movement, well, now we're having all these legal attacks, right, against trans people, but also against gay people. Depends on the state and area. And these are now being fought primarily by like the ACLU and organizations that have developed very advanced trans and queer rights elements or offices inside their agenda. There are these groups like Human Rights Campaign, which I have never met anyone who works for that organization. I couldn't even tell you who's in charge of it. I know they have an enormous budget. I don't know what they spend it on. So it's like, I think it's living in 3 different arenas. That's how I understand it. Yes.
I just want to ask you, because maybe this was not so much mentioned in the film, but maybe it's in your book about more about the organization of the movement, the structure of the movement, how more thinking of the solidarity inside the movement itself, like how you were dealing with the funding question, how you're dealing with the class question, like different classes inside the movement, different races, how you were working on the political.
Yeah, all of this is in my book, but I'll give you some examples because it's it is the big question, right?
Yeah.
Because this is a movement that had very diverse constituencies, that had different layers of access and power. Now, the way fundraising was done was that there were some very elite people in ACT UP, and there were people who were in the elite art world. And they held an art auction where famous artists donated paintings, and they sold it, and they raised $650,000. Now, that money belonged to the whole organization. So when women with AIDS needed money to go to Washington to travel to testify at a hearing, and of course they needed to stay in hotels because they were sick, we didn't have to raise that money. We could go to fundraising and get the money. When the Latino caucus decided to go to Puerto Rico to help start ACT UP Puerto Rico, they didn't have to raise the money. You know, we sent 15 people from the Latino caucus to Puerto Rico. That was all paid for from fundraising. At the same time, women and people of color in ACT UP never stopped the action to demand like consciousness raising on sexism or something like that. That never happened. What they did was they kept their eye on their prize of what they wanted, their campaigns for their constituencies, and they marshaled the ample resources of the dominant group to get what they needed for their constituency. And, you know, I don't know if people would be comfortable working that way today, but it is effective. There was a large Latino presence in ACT UP because this was the time of fascist dictatorships in Chile and Argentina. And there were quite a few, especially university students, who were in exile in the United States. There also were people from the Mexico City student movement of the 1960s. So the Latinos and lesbians in ACT UP tended to be much more politically active and had been in previous movements and came into ACT UP with a more sophisticated level of political function. Of the white gay men, and it was a predominantly white gay male organization, the older men had been in gay liberation, but most of the younger men had no political experience whatsoever. So even though women and people of color were minorities, they had enormous influence because they knew how to do things. You know, so, I mean, I go into it in great depth. I have 3 chapters on Latinos in ACT UP, and there was an Asian Pacific Islander caucus. There was something called Majority Action Caucus, which was all people of color. Then there were the treatment people who were trying to get medications, and they tended to be more elite. And then there were people who were working on housing for homeless people, on Haitians. There was a coup in Haiti, and a lot of Haitians were trying to come to the United States. And as you know, the United States never wants Black immigrants. And many Haitians were HIV positive, and they were incarcerated by the US government in Guantanamo. So before Guantanamo was for Muslim political prisoners, it was for HIV positive Haitians. And ACT UP worked in a Haitian underground railroad system to get people out of Guantanamo. All of that is in my book, but it's not in film. Also, if you go to the ACT UP Oral History, if you go to actuporalhistory.org, we have a whole page of documents from the Latino caucus and footage as well. Anything else? All right, well, thank you very much. It's been really great talking to you.